American weapons and ammunition are finally reaching the front lines in the war between Russia and Ukraine, and it's finally starting to make a difference. At least that's the claim that some make. We'll see if that's actually the case. We're going to dive into that. And there's nobody better. One of the growing favorites on our show is former CIA analyst Larry Johnson to kind of help break down what's actually happening and what people are claiming and if there's any difference between the two. Larry, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much, Danny. Great to be with you.
It's great to have you back here too, and because we can always count on you you're going to tell us what you think the real truth is, and based on your experience and all that, no matter where it falls down on. That's one of the hallmarks of our show and why we love having you on here. But let's get to that first point there, because, back in a month or so ago, after 6 months of bickering around, the U.S. finally said, you know what? Yeah, we're going to give you $61 billion. And to great fanfare, the stuff went out. And even though most of the American leaders were hyping that like 50 billion of it was, or almost 50 billion was going to America and not even going to Ukraine, but that's a separate issue. We'll talk about that another time. But always this claim was, this is going to make the difference. This is going to turn the tables and all this kind of stuff. And so now then the weapons and the ammunition has finally started showing up. And earlier today on NBC News, there was a claim that it's making a difference. And if you could throw that headline up there. And when you watch this, there's a clip that goes along with it when they're investigating some things on the ground, and they say, hey, they showed a tank commander, a Ukrainian tank commander. The NBC reporter went on the ground to Ukraine, and they said, it's arriving at the nick of time. But one of the things that they're not talking about is what that does to the actual tactical balance between the sides. I have no doubts that he's telling the truth in that tank commander, and that, yes, it's great to have it if it's showing up. I mean, if you only had 5 shells a day to shoot, or 2 or 3 tank shells, if that's all you had, and now all of a sudden you've got 10 or 15 a day, well, that's going to be better. But is that making a difference? What's your understanding of that?
Yeah. Does that tank come with its pre-equipped tank crew that's trained to operate, as well as the maintenance guys? This is the problem with this. They deliver this stuff without explaining, they say, here's the tank. And then you go, well, where's the crew? And they'll say, oh, you wanted a crew? You mean somebody to drive the tank and to load it and to fire it? Oh, that's extra. You didn't pay for that, so we'll add that onto the bill. And maintenance. Oh, yeah, for every hour it's out there, you got to do 8 hours of maintenance. Oh, we didn't tell you about that either? Okay, this is the disconnect from reality with these guys. They don't understand what the full operational needs are of this kind of equipment, coupled with the fact that Ukraine's biggest problem is not lack of U.S. Western supplied military equipment, tanks, howitzers, ammunition to put in those howitzers. It's called people, trained people. It's not just some warm body that you've drug off the street, shoved in the van, put a uniform on, and then thrown out there, or put them in the driver's seat of the tank. You've got to have people that have been through training, that know how to both use the equipment, and then to use the equipment in conjunction with other people that are wearing the uniform. They don't have this.
Yeah.
So, it's crazy.
There's so little recognition and understanding of that, even though, we keep saying this over and over. I know you and I many times have mentioned it's men, not money, is what you're going to have. You got to have the cash. You have to have the tanks and whatnot. But if you don't have the trained crew and all the leaders at the various levels to be able to use the things you just said, it's just pointless. And we've seen that play out. That's exactly what happened in 2023, when all of those hundreds of Western tanks and thousands of other combat vehicles that were given to them, if you don't have a crew that knows how to operate them, and you don't have the system, and that definitely includes the maintenance, which is just as important as being able to fire the tank. Because if you can't keep it up, you're not going to fire anything anyway. But you saw they were just obliterated on the battlefield and succeeded in nothing. But now we seem to be wanting to try it again.
Well, in fact, those Western tanks, as I understand it, they come at a different disadvantage with the Russians. The Russian tanks have automatic loaders. The Western tanks mean you got some guy in there who's picking up the shells and having to, put them in, and then having to, so right away, as opposed to a 3-man crew, you wind up with a 4-man crew. And it's still, it's tight conditions. It's not like, you're living in a 4,000 square foot house. These are, this is where the being a little smaller is an advantage as opposed to being, 6'4" and 285 pounds. That's not exactly.
And I'll tell you that again swings back to the train crew issue and the trained soldiers, because I was in an M1 unit, and when we had loaders that were trained so good that they could lob 3 rounds in about 10 seconds if they're really good, but the autoloader takes about 10 seconds to cycle 1 round. So if you have a really trained crew, you can outshoot any of the Soviet era stuff. But if you don't have a trained crew, you might not be able to go as fast as the Soviet crew. And I think that's what we saw.
Yeah. And look at the casualty figures that are coming in now. Just yesterday, what's been reported, 1,750 Ukrainian losses a day. Sometimes it's up to 2,000 a day. Well, that's like we lost 4,000 in Iraq over a 14-year period.
Yeah.
And we were concerned about those losses. So we don't have really anything to comprehend the amount of loss that Ukraine's experiencing. And then out of that, they're supposed to suddenly manufacture trained crews that can operate all this equipment. It's just.
And so what is going to be the net of all this ammunition is finally getting to the front, like they're saying? People say that's going to make a difference. Is the ammunition alone going to make a difference? And have you seen any changes on the front line based on this?
No. In fact, the Ukrainians are losing territory. The one that makes a big difference if you've got these the stock shares and say Lockheed Martin or Raytheon or General Dynamics, and that's in your portfolio or your retirement account, baby, you're doing good. You're a happy camper. It's putting some more money on your bottom line. And so as long as you're on this side of the ocean, it's good. That side of the ocean, not so good. This notion that there are the only game changer, and I had this, Scott Ritter and I had a friendly disagreement 2 years ago when they first introduced the M777s. He said it was a game changer. I said, no, it's not. It's a real changing of the situation. It's just going to add some more casualties, but it's not going to change the strategic and tactical situation. Drones, however, are a game changer. The way the drones have changed literally combat on the battlefield, and how units operate, and how they train, and how they have to put together their tanks now with cages and houses on top of them, for Pete's sake. That's a game changer. And so that's something new that really, I think military strategists are still trying to wrap their minds around.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, how does this work now going forward?
Yeah, that's the question, and it's going to be a while before anybody figures that stuff out. It reminds me of in the latter stages of World War I, actually, when the tank and the machine gun started off was a game changer then, and then later on they had the tank at the very end, and they were really trying to figure out how all that went. And it wasn't until the interwar period where it was really mastered by a number of folks, figured out what to do with it. So I think that the real utility is going to come after this war is over, and God help us whenever the next one comes, because it could be much, much more lethal. And especially the side that figures it out the best is going to be in a really good place.
And what's interesting, you notice the United States is not supplying the smaller drones. I mean, we could supply a Predator, we could supply something on that scale, but we're not. So as far as supplying what Ukraine is really needing on the battlefield to actually try to make have an impact on the Russians, it would be drones, not artillery, and we're not supplying those.
Yeah, We're not, and I think probably part of the reason is because we don't have it, and we don't have the industrial capacity to make it at scale anyway. But that's that's another issue which we can pick up at another time. I want to slightly shift bases here because what you said something a second ago, which I think is crucial to understanding anything. Tactical information, tactical actions are very important because you can't win a war without them. But by themselves, they don't determine the outcome of a war. That begins on the strategic and diplomatic levels. And on that regard, I see some real major problems on the Western side, which I think could come back to really haunt us pretty big. And I want to take a look at that. So we just had this kind of dueling peace proposals. First of all, I think it was last Thursday by Vladimir Putin. He talked about what he thinks is a viable path to peace. Obviously, it's in his advantage for it to come to pass. And then you had over the weekend in Switzerland, you had the Western version. It was with Zelensky leading that. Now, there are radically different interpretations of exactly what happened on both of those over the weekend here, but we're going to unpack some of this because the way the Western leaders have responded to both of those, I think, is indicative and a warning of what may come in the coming months and maybe even into next year if things drag out that far. First of all, I want to take a look at Alex Mercouris, who was on the Duran earlier today, talking about some of this. And he said something I thought was very interesting and very noteworthy in how the Swiss conference actually came about. And I think when we pick up this clip here, he had just gotten through saying that initially the plan was to invite Russia as an observer. And Russia says, hell no, we're not going to come and just sit there and watch and maybe it's going to be a punching bag. So we're not going to come with that. After it was decided that Russia said they're not coming, this happened.
The person who apparently insisted that they go ahead with it was Zelensky. And there were reports that in April, Western governments tried to contact him. There was a meeting with Western ambassadors in which Zelensky was told this conference isn't really working. Fewer and fewer countries are attending. There's growing opposition to what we're trying to do there. Apparently, he went absolutely hysterical. He threw a tantrum. And I think the main reason he insisted on going ahead was the one you gave in a program that we did about a week ago, in which we also discussed this conference, which is that putting aside the question of whether there was going to be support for his so-called peace plan, he wanted a conference to take place. He wanted all the major leaders there because his own position as president of Ukraine is now in question. The Russians are openly saying that he's not the legitimate president of Ukraine because he cancelled elections. And he wanted the embrace of world leaders in order to show to the world and to the Ukrainian people, and of course also to the Russians, that yes, he is the internationally recognized and supported president of Ukraine.
See, to me, that answers the question that we had, because we had a couple of shows setting up before this thing happened and another one after it happened in a post-mortem. And one of the questions I kept asking, and it was just a head scratcher, is why the West and all these other countries and Zelensky himself, why they would hold a conference that didn't even have the other half of the equation, which makes it a literal impossibility to have any kind of even a path to negotiated settlement. And Alexander seems to provide it here that Zelensky needed that for his own domestic credibility as a position of the leader at all, which is something you've talked about a lot.
Yeah, and so his popular support has slipped. Now, it's worth noting, I think he still is more popular in Ukraine than Joe Biden is in the United States. So, take a look at that. He's got like 56% support and Biden's down to 34%. So, maybe Zelensky would be better off coming to the United States and running for president. He would, he might surge as a front runner, but his credibility, the Russians are pushing the legal issue that his term expired. He has illegally suspended the elections. He's used the war as an excuse. And they're losing on the battlefield. Zelensky may also have done this to try to buy himself some insurance against his own domestic opponents within the military, because they're increasingly unhappy with him. But the Ukrainians are faced with this. They failed to take the best deal that was offered them, and now they're getting a worse deal. And if they don't take this worse deal, it's going to get, even more bad. It's going to be untenable. They'll be faced with unconditional surrender. Because if you think back in March of 2022, they had a chance that Russia was offering, okay, we'll pull our troops out. You'll retain control of Luhansk and Donetsk. They'll get some independence where their rights will be protected, but, we'll pull out. Well, that was 2 years ago, and, they said, oh, no, we're not going to do that. Okay. Now, here's Russia saying, all right, we're going to keep Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, and you pull your troops out. Russia didn't say anything about pulling its troops out, and you don't join NATO. Well, that was immediately rejected. How dare Russia offer something like that? How can it do that? What's its on what position does it have? Well, the fact is it occupies those areas right now and are steadily killing the Ukrainians and pushing them back. And the next stage will be what the Russians left out. They didn't say a thing about Odessa. They didn't say a thing about Kiev. Kiev is a Russian city. The West better not ever forget that, no matter how many times I'm going to proclaim it as some sort of, sacred Ukrainian symbol. It's not. It was the birthplace of Christianity in Russia more than 1,000 years ago. There wasn't a Ukraine back then. Ukraine is a recent creation. So Putin left. He didn't mention that as something that they could, that had to be negotiated about. It was out there on the table, could have been discussed. Now it won't be discussed. I guarantee it. So the next stage when they come back will probably be Ukraine's option to do unconditional surrender.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things I've been afraid of for quite some time, and we'll see if anything can change all that. Getting back to the unrealistic and interpretation of events and an unwillingness to look at any of the realities of that. Let's stick for a second with the Swiss conference itself. Mm-hmm. Zelensky had wanted to have as unified and strong of a communique as possible with the backing of all these different countries, and it really fell apart quickly. I think that they ended up with 70 nations, either with heads of states or senior officials that signed it. And while that's not a bad number by itself, it's the ones who didn't sign it is like the flashing red lights. There was no China, there's no Brazil, no Saudi Arabia, and this one from India was one of the most damning ones. Check this out.
Our participation in this summit and continued engagement with all stakeholders is with a view to understanding different perspectives, approaches, and options to find a way forward for a sustainable resolution of the conflict. In our view, only those options acceptable to both parties can lead to abiding peace. In line with this approach, we have decided to avoid association with the joint communique or any other document emerging from this summit.
Okay, so Larry, that's bad enough. That's bad enough to when a major power like India comes to the conference and then doesn't sign it and then makes a statement about it. That's bad enough. But to me, you tell me if you disagree with this, what's worse is our reaction to it as voiced here by the estimable Matt Miller.
You had over 90 countries that attended this peace summit. You had over 80 countries and international organizations that signed on to the final communique. We think both of those numbers represent a very significant show of support for Ukraine and for not just peace, but a just and lasting peace, something that we have always made clear. So look, it is Russia that initiated this conflict. It is Russia that has escalated this conflict every step of the way, not NATO, not the United States.
I'll just leave it to you.
I mean, the guy lies. I mean, he's a liar. He can't even accurately record the number of people that were there and accurately record the number of people that really signed. And and being excited because Nauru and Vanuatu signed on to the communique. Okay, great. Two specks of sand that are out in the middle of the Pacific that mean absolutely nothing. When you don't have China, you don't have India, and let's be honest, not even demented Joe Biden went. They send in the second string, Kamala Harris.
That was also very telling.
She stuck around long enough to read the speech that was given her, and then she bailed. Olaf Scholz, the German, he did sort of the thing. So it's not like one of these places where everybody wanted to be seen. And look, the timing of this was not just an accident that they scheduled this right after the G7 summit in Italy. Because you know where Italy is, you know where Switzerland is. It's just hop over the mountains and you're there. You got an hour plane flight, maybe 2 hours, and I'm sure they were calculating. Oh, this way it'll be easy for Sleepy Joe to get here and put his imprimatur on it. Nope, he didn't want to be seen anywhere near that. He wanted to be out in Hollywood, staring off into the crowd, having to be dragged off stage by Barack Obama. So when you send those kinds of symbols that you say, yeah, it's important, it's really important, and then you send your worst player out there to do it, you're sending the message, okay, we're really actually not serious about this. The rest of the world picks those signals up. And what stuns me is that people like Miller, I know the definition of a diplomat, at least when I was at State, was, someone who's paid to lie for their country. But good grief, man, they're not paying him enough to lie like that.
And, the thing that it just puzzles me is that why would we want to make those kind of statements? Now, those play well to an American audience who just watches the mainstream network. They don't get all of the deep dive stuff that we get here and all this great analysis that you provide. So you get the depth of the context that goes along with it. And you can see, just how absurd it is. And now, non-Americans, they're not, fooled like that. And they see this. For him to suggest that Ukraine is getting the crap kicked out of it is going to somehow have a just and lasting peace, which is defined as a submission by the Russian side and a complete abject surrender. That's how he defines a just peace, is even on the realm of possibility. Now, Putin does have the capacity to exert conditions that are absolutely in his favor and bad for the Ukraine side, but he has the power to make good on it if we don't negotiate. It doesn't work in the opposite direction.
Yeah, look, this is akin, this will play out like it did when von Paulus surrendered at Stalingrad, or Donetsk surrendered in Germany. At the end when they were beaten. They were physically beaten, and the Germans could not continue. Yeah, they still had some soldiers out there, and the others, some still had ammunition and could fire. But in terms of fighting to make any kind of difference on the battlefield, that's going to come to an end. And that's what the West is not grasping. Now, the danger here is the rhetoric and the actions in the West are becoming increasingly belligerent in terms of threatening Russia with nuclear consequences. And the Russians are paying attention to that. When you hear, Kirby say that, hey, we'll keep supplying Ukraine until they defeat Russia. So we're not even trying to pretend that we're just there to support. No, our objective is the physical defeat of Russia. And if you're on the Russian general staff, you're listening to that, you go, okay, they're not just making this up. They're coming after us. We got to be ready. Then you have Stoltenberg said, oh, yeah, we're going to need to expand the nuclear weapons in NATO. What? So now we're boosting the nuclear threat from the standpoint of NATO. Then you got B-52s that are flying up to the territorial limits of Russia, forcing Russians to scramble jets to come after. This is like you got a guy that's in a gunpowder magazine lighting up cigarettes. Something bad's going to happen.
Well, and in apparently an attempt to one up Matt Miller, John Kirby, who's apparently one of your closest friends, I see now, tries to one up him, and he's got a way for this war to end quickly.
Look, my response to Mr. Putin is this. If you're so worried about becoming the victim of attacks, and you're worried about your troops' livelihoods and your military units, then get the hell out of Ukraine. You don't have any business being in there in the first place. That's my best advice to Mr. Putin.
Well, I'm sure that Vladimir Putin is going, well, thank you, John. That's very helpful to you. But
Yeah,
I mean, that is so, again, it's just, we keep saying this over and over. It sounds like a broken record, detached from reality.
Well, and look, the Russians are sitting there saying, okay, Ukraine's in our backyard. What the hell are you doing in Syria? You've had troops in Syria now for 10 years, well, actually 12 years. What are you doing? And yeah, when they get killed, you get all upset, the United States. So, this kind of hypocrisy, it just stinks to high heaven. And the United States refuses to come to grips with the reality that we're the ones creating the provocation. And people say, oh, Johnson, you're a hate America kind of guy. No, I'm not a hate America kind of guy, but I can step back and look at it rationally. If Russia had spent the last 16 years conducting an annual naval and military exercise on land in Mexico and in the Caribbean, where Russian Marines were landing on Mexican beaches up around Veracruz, for example, and they were doing this year after year, we would be concerned. We would view that as a threat, a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. We'd view that as a threat to us as a country. And yet, we turn around and we have done that in the Black Sea up until 2021, from 2007 to 2021. And we're going, what's the problem with these Russians? God, they're sensitive.
We're a defensive alliance. We're not offensive.
Yeah.
We don't are a threat to anyone.
Yeah, and explain to me how Marines coming off of a landing craft is a defensive operation. When you look at, Tarawa, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, as I seem to recall, those were more like offensive operations.
On the way
But,
to
maybe I didn't read my history careful enough.
Well, unfortunately, that's not the end for Kirby, because there's a couple of other things that I feel an obligation to show, because I really want to just show that this is some of our contention, that we're detached from reality and working antithetical to American interests. If anybody thinks that we're not pro-American, then they don't understand anything about what's going on, because I want America to survive and not get dragged into a war that no one can win, and we would be bad losers. And the more we go down these paths, the closer we get to that. So I think that it's being the most patriotic thing you can do to show the truth and to show ways to avoid the worst outcomes. Instead, we see this also from John Kirby.
It has not been a very clear pathway. When would they be able to do the action plan that they can get on?
First, they got to win this war. Right? They got to win the war first. And so, number one, we're doing everything we can to make sure they can do that. Then when the war's over, no matter what it looks like, they're still going to have a long border with Russia and a legitimate security threat to the Ukrainian people. That's why the president at the G7 signed our bilateral security agreement, joining some other 14, 15 other countries that have done the same thing, to make sure that for the long haul, Ukraine's defense industrial base can continue to make sure that they have what they need to defend themselves, and that includes assistance from the United States. That's the long haul. That will help them defend themselves while they work on the necessary things they have to do, like any member of the alliance has to work on, for instance, on corruption, before they can apply for NATO membership. But we do believe that NATO is in Ukraine's future.
So the one thing that started this war in the beginning was NATO expansion and ignoring all the warnings that have been coming since 2008. And now that we want to say we have a long-term deal, so that whatever you think, Russia, we are still coming into NATO on Ukraine. All of this 2.5 years of war has not solved that problem for us. Now, where is the motivation for the Russian side to have any kind of an accommodation with that?
Oh yeah, no, they've reached they're past the fed up point. Now, just a side comment. I sure wish that John Kirby and Joe Biden were as concerned about the U.S. southern border and protecting it as they are about protecting Ukraine's border with Russia, for God's sake. I mean, good Lord. You know, they're given more money, more attention, more weapons to protect a border that's thousands of miles away and not protect our own. And you're correct. The Russian, if you've watched and listened to what, and we talked about this even when I was on your program from St. Petersburg, it was that week that it was the week of June 3rd. That was the week that Putin, Lavrov, so the presidency and the foreign ministry, their tone changed. They did it's almost like a 180. There was no more, they eliminated the ambiguity. They established very clearly that they think that, they keep telling, they're warning now the United States. You're poking us in the chest. We're not going to take it. We're going to punch back. We're going to provide weapons to people that are attacking you. We're going to make your life miserable. If you follow through on what you're talking about doing and equipping Ukraine to attack us in our country, we're coming back at you. And they made that very clear. They didn't mince words about it. And that's what Putin was very direct about in his comments last Friday, when he spoke before the foreign ministry, or maybe that was Thursday. But there was no ambiguity there. And then to top it off, sort of the icing on the cake, was Medvedev, the former president. He was blistering, just absolutely blistering in what he posted. And so, and none of the Western media is reporting on that. They're pretending like it doesn't exist. And
or that they're bluffing. That's what I hear a lot too. Especially Medvedev. He's just a clown. Don't even listen to anything he says. And certainly he is prone to a lot of hyperbole and lots of colorful language. But given his proximity to Putin and his position, I just don't think you can afford to ignore it.
No. And Putin's under a lot of domestic political pressure to do more, to hit back harder. That, he's not leading the way on this. He's actually restraining the popular sentiment in Russia.
Yeah, I wonder if you could go down that path for a little bit, because we often hear that Putin is Hitler. He's the evil guy, so he's the one leading all this. But then I know I've heard you in the past say that he's actually quite restrained from what others in the Russian sphere want to do. And that you don't want him to be out because he could be replaced by somebody even further to the right. I wonder if you could explain how that works.
Yeah, I've not seen the show myself, but I've talked with Pepe Escobar, who has. And there are different, they have multiple television channels in Russia. It's not, just one channel. They've got, like the good old days when there were more than one network in the United States. And on all of those networks, they have talk shows. And on all of those talk shows, they have legislators, members of the Duma, they have governors, they have common citizens. All are agitating for much stronger action against the United States and against NATO. Attacks to retaliate for killing the civilians in Belgorod. So, and what Putin definitely signaled last week is, we're going to do that. They're not so, and I don't think the West is prepared for that because we've convinced ourselves they're bluffing. But it's one thing to be playing poker when all you're risking is 50 cents, 2 quarters, and you're bluffing with that. Okay, you can afford to lose that. They're bluffing with nuclear weapons here.
Okay, and that brings me up to a really important point here, because we're talking about that in this game, nuclear weapons are on the table. Yeah. So if you had a big card game, and those are some of the chips that are on the table. One of the biggest threats, and I think risks, when you're talking about nuclear weapons, is miscommunication or misunderstandings here. And so you've got to be very clear about where your genuine red lines are. And here is where we have a huge failure that I think is not commonly understood. And I want to get your reaction to a couple of things. I'm going to show you 2 different videos by 2 senior officials, one of which is Kirby again, talking about 2 radically different objectives for the United States. First, John Kirby.
We have to stand up to aggressors. You can't let them
just change borders by force. And we have done that. And it's not just the United States. 50 some other nations have helped Ukraine try to beat back this aggression. And you're right about Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea. That is Ukrainian soil. And they have every right to claim that soil back. It's their country. And we want to make sure they have the tools to do that and the skills to do that. And we're going to continue to provide that kind of support.
So then President Biden agrees with the 1991 Ukraine territory?
Of course.
Of course. So that was 11 days ago. You had John Kirby saying the president of the United States is on board with the policy that says Ukraine should be able to win back to the 1991 borders. That's one. Now, here's number two. This past weekend, Jake Sullivan.
President Zelensky has made clear, including here in Switzerland, that ultimately this war will have to be determined at the negotiating table. The United States' goal has been to put Ukraine in as strong as possible a position on the battlefield, so it is in as strong a position as possible at the negotiating table. It's up to Ukraine to decide when and how that occurs. Its strength at the negotiating table will be improved by what's happened here in Switzerland, because you have more than 100 countries and international organizations coming together to lay a foundation for a just peace built on a simple proposition. You cannot take territory by force. It says that in the United Nations Charter. It's at the core of international law. Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity has to be respected.
Okay, which is it? Is it our policy? Is we want a negotiated settlement, so we want the best deal we can get? Or is it we want to completely conquer and drive Russia out of all of Ukraine back to the 1991 borders? Because those things are not compatible.
Yeah, well, and this is just a further example of the incompetence of the Biden administration. You know, I worked during the Reagan administration. I worked during the George H.W. Bush administration, and even some during the Bill Clinton administration. And all three, despite their political differences, still had some measure of message discipline where they weren't sending mixed signals about what our policy was, what our objectives were. I mean, and look here, just between, you compare what Matt Miller said with what Jake Sullivan. You know, Miller had it at 90 countries. Now it's over 100 countries are at that summit. My God, the whole world was at the summit. There was 100, you know, the numbers keep escalating. And instead of dealing with the reality, I said, no, we couldn't get everybody, you know, most of the world didn't show up, you know, and we didn't get even the important countries. We can't say that. So yeah, this kind of mixed signals, and the foreigners. I was involved several years ago in training what was called a senior crisis management seminar, and so the members of a foreign government would come to the United States, and we would run a seminar on crisis management for it. And I kept running into this is right after we had invaded Iraq in 2003. And I'm talking countries from Latin America, from Europe, and from Asia, and from the Middle East. It wasn't just one. Every single one of these countries would pull, you know, one member or other would pull me aside after, you know, I did the lecture. They go, okay, tell us the truth. What's the U.S. purpose here in Iraq? What are you really trying to do? Because they assumed that we had some secret plan, because they knew that they lied to us and that they wouldn't always tell us the truth. So they figured we're lying to them. And I had to say to them, I said, no, guys, we really haven't thought this through. There is no broad strategic plan behind this. We're just sort of making it up as we go. And they were like shocked. And so when they're listening to what Sullivan and now Kirby are saying, their heads got to be spinning around like, you know, the girl in the Exorcist movie.
Uncomfortable ramifications for that also seem to be relevant. Yeah. But yeah, I've actually had the exact same experience in both Afghanistan and in Iraq, where people were asking me, international field folks were asking me the same question. So I've experienced that pain as well. Yeah. But then it's funny because maybe not funny, but it was sad, is that you contrast it, because you mentioned a second ago, you had the Russian foreign minister, the Russian presidency are lockstep in what they're saying. And then you talk about image. So you have the United States really humiliating itself on the international stage by Biden not even showing up to the Swiss peace conference. He sent Kamala over there to make a token appearance and you know, beat feet and left. Then you have Putin, who just landed in North Korea a bit ago. Gary was showing some of that scene a second ago.
Yeah.
And so you see it's very, very, a strong showing. It's actually resulting in something. They're getting millions of rounds of ammunition, rockets, all kinds of things. Prior to this, you had the Putin Xi Jinping meeting, which also has diplomatic consequences and production from the Russian side. So you see the world is starting to see every time the Russians get out there, they're doing something, they're accomplishing something. And when we get out there, we have these complete mixed messages. You have us embarrassing ourselves on the national stage, and we don't seem to even know where we're going. These things are going to have consequences even beyond the outcome of this war.
Right. Yeah. Well, we tried to isolate Russia. And in fact, it's now counterintuitive. We did the exact opposite. By our efforts to punish Russia with economic sanctions, to cut them off from SWIFT, to try to make them an international pariah, we've now made Russia stronger than it's ever been in the last 50 years. I would argue Russia is out now at the top of its economic game, and it's economic and it's diplomatic. They're not wielding influence around the world because they're out with armies invading countries. In fact, one of the things that's happening in North Korea, it's, the Western analysts get it all wrong. They say, oh, Russia's desperate for North Korea weapons. Oh, that's nonsense. What's going on, though, Russia's given North Korea an active live laboratory where they can test their weapons to see how they work in an actual combat environment. And so Ukraine, the North Koreans have got their technical personnel. They're embedded with the Russians as they fire ballistic missiles and other missile systems, tracking how they operate and seeing how are they as accurate as they were engineered, designed to be. That's number one. Number two, Putin's going to make good on his threat that if the West starts hitting inside Russia, North Korea is going to have everything it needs from Russia. Russia's got technically superior weapon systems than North Korea. North Korea's got a lot of quantity, but Russia's got a lot of quality. So, this game that's being played from a diplomatic standpoint, where the global South is following up, and like I said, just compare and contrast. At the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, 136 countries, and that is not an exaggeration. Compare that with what they got at Birkenstock. I couldn't believe they have a city in Switzerland named after those clunky shoes. But
but yeah, that's what that is.
Yeah.
Gary, I wonder if I could ask you to pull up something in a minute here. If you could pull up that Biden conversation with Zelensky, and I think it was the 5th or the 6th of June, where he was listing of that we're going to stay there forever. If you could grab that, I want to show that in just a second, because you just said something that spurred got my memory. You talked about the contrast in imagery. And so we just talked about it here a little bit, and we're going to talk about it again in a second. But when people see even not just the countries or the governments, but the heads of state, you're seeing a couple of contrasts that is not playing well for us. And you're not the only one I've had on this show talking about this, but I keep hearing that whether you're talking about large parts of Asia, the global South, Africa, South America, et cetera, even now encroaching parts of the Middle East, our reputation and credibility is just falling further and further into the dirt. And Russia's is rising at the same time, in large measure because of all these, problems that we're having, all this contradictory messaging, seeking after things that are self-evidently not going to happen. They're never going to happen. And then when you look at the heads of state, first of all, I want to show you, this is what Putin said. I think it was last Thursday when he was listing where he stands on what could be an actual peace. Actually, we don't have that one, I guess. You don't have the Russian one there, Gary? It's coming. All right. So I'll have to I threw a curveball there when he was looking for a slider. So that's on me. But this is something we had to do a little audible here. But this is something you're going to want to see. But before I show that, I wonder if you can tell me your view, Larry, about what the global South is actually thinking, and is that something we need to worry about? Because a lot in America will say they're the second and third tier anyway, so they don't really matter.
Well, again, the U.S. approach with the global South has been one of threat. We threaten them. We're not enticing them. We're not romancing them. We're not buying them candies and bottles of wine to say, hey, come be our friend. We're telling them, if you don't do what we say, we're going to impose economic sanctions on you. Oh, hey, Angola, you passed this law that's what we view as anti-LGBTQ. So therefore, we're going to impose some economic sanctions on you. And these countries are going, what the hell? Who do these Americans think they are, that they can come in and tell us what to do? And then what they encounter with the Russians is the Russians are not telling them what they need to think, how they need to act, what they need to say. The Russians are treating them, saying, oh, hey, what are your views? What are your thoughts? They get treated equally like that. But they're also seeing the images. What we saw with Biden at Normandy on June 6th, where they're watching that parachute demonstration, and he starts wandering off, and the Prime Minister of Italy, Meloni, has to run over and fetch him to keep him from, going away. They see that. And, when those world leaders are in a room with Biden, they sense, I had an experience several years ago with one of the original members of SEAL Team 6 when Marcinko set that up. And he was now out. We'd been working together and exercising. And I was with another friend of mine who was an Africa specialist in the military. And so when we met with Norm, boy, he was forgetful. He was forgetting names. He was showing all signs of, and he was only 62. He was showing signs of early dementia, and he died a few years later of Alzheimer's. And we attributed it to, apparently he'd had some brain injuries when he was with the team. The point was, when we met with him, we knew, Dell and I knew, talking to Norm, that there was a real problem, but you didn't feel comfortable telling him that he had a problem. And even if we told him, we're not sure he would have understood it. Well, that's what's happening with Biden right now. And I mean, and this is no joke. When the rest of the world sees that, and if you're the Russians and you recognize the United States has a guy that's not mentally competent, supposedly in charge, the real question comes up: who is in charge? Okay, who's making the decisions?
And here's what people are saying. This is. I'm going to show you two examples here, one on each side. This is what is consistent on each side. First, here's President Biden in Normandy.
Danny, I have the one where he's sitting there with Zelensky.
That's the one I'm talking about.
Okay, he's not. Got it. Yep. Okay.
You haven't bowed down. You haven't yielded at all. You continue to fight in a way that is just remarkable. Just remarkable. And we're not going to walk away from you. I apologize for those weeks of not knowing what's going to happen in terms of funding, because we had trouble getting the bill that we had to pass that had the money in it from some of our very conservative members who were holding it up. But we got it done finally, and since then, including today, I've announced 6 packages of significant funding. Today I'm also signing an additional package for $225 million to help you reconstruct the electric grid. But once we got the national security bill passed, that was a political issue. We were able to get it all done. And the way you stood and holding on in Kharkiv, And you've proven once again the people of Ukraine cannot and will never be overtaken. And I assure you, the United States is going to stand with you. I've said that all during this debate. I continue to say it. The United States is standing with you. You are the bulwark against the aggression that's taking place. We have an obligation to be there. And so I'm looking forward to having a detailed discussion with you about where we go from here. But we're still in completely, thoroughly. Thank you.
So if you're still awake, if that didn't put you to sleep, you can see it's like, again, it's just kind of this rambling kind of thing that even Zelensky, you could see his body language just kind of like going, are you okay? That's contrasted with the leader of Russia, who looked like this last weekend.
The essence of our proposal is not some kind of temporary truce or suspension of fire, as, for example, the West wants. This is not about freezing the conflict, but about its final completion. And I will say again, as soon as Kiev agrees to a similar course of events proposed today, agrees to the complete withdrawal of its troops from the DPR and LPR in the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, and really begins this process, we are ready to begin negotiations without delaying them. I repeat, this is our principled position. Neutral, non-aligned, nuclear-free status of Ukraine, its demilitarization and denazification.
He is absolutely clear on what he wants. He is consistent. He has been saying that since before the war started, all the way through. He's never had a different message. Everybody knows where he stands. And now that he's basically telling you he has the capacity to keep going, or he can have a negotiated settlement. He's apparently cool either way, but one way or another, he's going to get those things there. And people know that he means what he says, I think, and he's not bluffing. When you look at those two, if you're not in Western Europe or the United States or Ukraine, if you're from literally anywhere else in the world and you're looking at those two leaders, it's hard to see how many people are going to come down and say they're equal, or that, yeah, I think America is the more powerful.
Yeah, no, exactly. And notice so Putin was reading that particular speech. He normally doesn't read a speech. And he doesn't even use a teleprompter. He normally will speak extemporaneously. But the message he was delivering there was specifically the Russian peace plan proposal. And his reading it was sending a message that they were being very precise, that he wasn't making this up on the fly. He wasn't speaking off the cuff. This is what Russia policy was clearly. Whereas, in contrast with Biden, yeah, he's reading off his note cards what they told him to say. And with that monotone, flat voice, you nailed it, Danny. All you got to do is start marketing that on Amazon as, hey, are you having trouble sleeping at night? Just simply play this tape before you go to bed, man. You'll be out in, 5 minutes. Because it is just, I testified before Biden on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Good Lord, 22 years ago. That's not the Joe Biden I remember. He could be animated and his voice would be, but nothing like that. I mean,
ironically, the first time I ever saw him in person was when I was actually working on the Hill as a lowly Senate staffer on Senator Kay Bailey Hutchinson's staff, but I had combat experience. And so when they were doing the original debate over whether we should expand NATO, she was at the time against it. And I was allowed to go with her on the Senate floor for the debate against Joe Biden. And so they were going back and forth there, whatever. And yeah, he was very animated. He was locked in, had all the details. He had some staff members there. He actually treated me very respectfully. I actually had good experience with him that time, even as lowly as I was. But when I contrast that to the man that I see on that video right there, it's just, I can't even believe they were the same person.
Yeah. And the rest of the world sees it. It's just, it's not healthy. And again, I come back to the point. If you're the foreign intelligence chief and you're being asked by Putin to say, okay, who's making the decisions in the U.S. government? I honest to God couldn't tell you. I mean, we can speculate. We can come up with, we think it's this, we think it's that. But if Biden's the real decision maker, that's alarming, because he's he's not sure where he is half the time. Or is it some other group? And if it's that group, then you go back to what you'd presented earlier, where you got John Kirby saying one thing and Jake Sullivan saying the other. Well, Sullivan supposedly is in charge of the National Security Council, and Kirby works for him, and yet Kirby's saying something completely different from Sullivan. So who's the conductor leading this orchestra, or what we faced with is just a jazz band where everybody's doing their own thing.
Yeah, and as we're seeing some of our comments from some of our viewers here, they're asking some of these same questions that you are. So let me ask you in the remaining time we have here, from a tactical perspective. Now Russia has not moved very fast, and yeah, even though they're moving methodical, it still is taking a long time. And even though they made some pretty good progress a month or two ago, even that has kind of slowed down. The arrival of these additional ammunition is also making it more difficult on the Russians. But if what you and I are saying is accurate, that the Ukraine side doesn't have the manpower to ever reverse the course, then at some point it's got to go down. Do you see this as I think I saw, who was that? Somebody that you and I both know, Larry Wilkerson actually said he thinks that potentially within 60 days there could be a major break in the Ukrainian front lines. I haven't had a chance to follow up to find out why he thought that. But what is your sense for, can this go another 60 days in a break, or can it even go another year? Can the Ukraine side keep on causing inch by inch for the Russian forward, but not to break? How do you see it playing out?
Yeah, I don't see how it would go another year, because what Russia is doing is, they're moving slowly and methodically. But the reason for that is, one, they're trying to minimize casualties, but two, they're forcing Ukraine into having to bring forces to the front. And as they bring them along their lines of communication, the Russians are hitting and attacking them and destroying them in many cases. Plus, they've now stretched the line in a way that it was always this, 1,000-kilometer long line, but Russia was not attacking at the same time all along the line a year ago like they are now. They are doing that now because both they have the manpower and the reserves in place to do it, as well as the supplies. So it is like that situation, if you think back to your kids' birthday parties, if you're blowing a balloon up and you keep blowing, you're going to reach a point where that balloon pops because you have stretched it beyond its capability to retain what it has, the air inside. And that's what I think the Russians are doing to the Ukrainians. They're forcing them to stretch their capabilities and degrading them in the process, degrading NATO militarily in the process, because NATO keeps pouring in this equipment that it can't replace. It would be one thing if they had the factories up and running throughout the United States and in Germany and in England that were cranking out this new materiel, vehicles and tanks and artillery and howitzers, but they're not. They just simply don't have that capability. They're looking at it. They're years away from being able to do that. So from Russia's standpoint, everything you can do to force them to expand their arsenal against you and take it out and weaken it is less that you're going to have to worry about down the line.
And do you see any prospect or any signs at all that Russia could have a hard time at some point, that the trough of recruits that have been coming in above what they have been losing in combat could slow down? Do you see any possibility of that?
Not at this juncture, in part because the elevated rhetoric from the West, which is so belligerent and talking about attacking and destroying Russia, it's building support for Putin. It's building support for the military effort. It's not debilitating them.
I see. Well, then that's I guess that's one thing we're going to have to watch for, because that's one of the things that one of the things I look for that I don't. It's kind of opaque, so I don't have much of an influence on it. I know that nobody can fight a war forever, and at some point there could be a loss of at least willingness to keep going on, especially if the casualties keep going up. But I just don't have a sense of what the real casualties are. I see these ridiculous claims by so many in the Western and Ukrainian press that, Russia is losing 1,000 people per day and these crazy meat assaults I keep hearing about. I don't see a lot of evidence on it, but who knows how much truth there may be to it.
I keep looking at social media. And so that's the one thing that neither Russia nor the Ukrainians can control and clamp down on. And that's why you keep seeing out of Ukraine all these videos popping up of Ukrainian recruitment efforts where they're dragging guys kicking and screaming off the streets. But also on that social media platforms, you're seeing for all these freshly dug graves. I mean, hundreds and just different pictures. And they're you're not seeing that on the Russian side. And it's not because Russia's clamping down and not allowing that. It's because it's not existing in the numbers that the Ukrainians are suffering. The Ukrainians are suffering World War II type of casualties, what the Soviets suffered at the hands of the Germans early on. And, that with enormous losses. But Russia so far has not been incurring that because the general staff have made it a point. They're not doing mass casualty assaults, and the units that have suffered most of the casualties in these battles have been the prisoners. They've not been the recruits.
Yeah, right. Well, we're going to have to wait and see how all this stuff plays out. I just can't imagine any good outcome for the Ukraine or the United States or the West. We just seem to be on an unsustainable position, and I just pray to God it doesn't get stupid. And whether through error, miscalculation, or mistake, end up with a nuclear weapon being discharged somewhere in the future. I don't see any threat of that today because Russia, I don't think, would ever use one unless unless something really reversed on the ground. So I think we're okay for the time being. But again, if you get some mistake somewhere, like someone authorizes something to be launched into Russia proper and it hits something sensitive, I mean, those calculations could change. And the faster we get the war over, the faster we get those off the table of possibility.
Yeah, amen to that.
Well, that's all we got for you today. But folks, I know a lot of you are really loving Larry Johnson on our show here. And if you want more Larry Johnson, go see him at sonar21.com. I think, is that the right address I put on
That's
there?
it.
That's the one there. So, yeah, you got a lot of good stuff there. We often go and check out what you have there. Invite you guys to do the same thing too. We also invite you to like and subscribe to the channel. We looked at some stats the other day, and 60% of the folks that are watching this are actually not subscribers. And folks, we need you to subscribe because that helps expand our view. It helps YouTube share it to more people, and it helps us with our promise to you to be unintimidated and uncompromised, and to give you the truth, the hard-hitting information, the great guests, the knowledgeable guests like today's Larry Johnson. We really need you to do that to help us out, to expand all of our ability to influence people, because we are literally all in this together. And we also invite you to become a member and join so that you can actually directly engage with us. Gary comes on during some of these. We're going to have another one on Friday. Be sure and watch for that one if you're a member, and join if you're not, because Gary's got some great stuff. He's not just somebody who can throw some videos around in the back. He's got some great ideas of his own, and you'll enjoy seeing those like the folks did on the last one we had here. All that's coming up on Friday for all those who join. In the meantime, we've got Doug McGregor on tomorrow, another of our big show favorites at 2:00 on Wednesday. Be sure to join us then, and we will see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.